The sound of polished boots scraping against the pavement shattered the peaceful hum of the park. A shadow loomed over the lone figure on the bench, a man lost in his own thoughts, unaware that trouble was approaching. "Hey you! Get up! You don't belong here!" The voice was sharp, authoritative, and laced with something uglier. But when the baton was raised, ready to strike, the officer made one fatal mistake. He had no idea who he was dealing with, and tonight he was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. Bryant Park, a quiet sanctuary in the heart of New York City. On any given day, people gathered under the towering trees, their laughter mingling with the rustling leaves. Children ran across the lush green lawns, couples strolled hand in hand, and the rhythmic trickle of the fountain painted a picture of peace. But not today. Today something darker stirred in the air. A man sat alone, hood pulled low, sunglasses shielding his eyes, not to hide but to escape, if only for a moment. He wasn't causing trouble. He wasn't looking for a fight. But trouble, it seemed, had found him. And soon, the entire park would witness a moment that would shake them all to their core. Vin Diesel sat alone in a quiet corner of the park where few people ventured. He wore a light gray hoodie, the hood pulled low over his face, and a pair of large sunglasses. He didn't want attention, only a few peaceful moments to unwind after his grueling work days. The bench he occupied was near a paved pathway and next to a small fountain where the sound of trickling water created a soothing atmosphere. Not everyone, however, was pleased with Vin's presence. Not far away, Officer Parker was patrolling the park, known in the Midtown Manhattan area, not for his dedication or integrity, but for his frequent discriminatory behavior and abuse of power. Parker often targeted individuals he deemed out of place in public spaces like Bryant Park. When Parker spotted Vin Diesel sitting on the bench, he immediately felt uneasy. Vin's hoodie and sunglasses made Parker think of troublemakers he always kept an eye on. That guy doesn't look like he belongs in the park. Parker muttered, gripping the baton on his belt tightly. He's definitely up to no good with that thought. Parker began walking toward Vin Diesel. His steps were heavy, his polished black boots scraping against the brick pathway, producing a sound as abrasive as his demeanor. Passers-by couldn't help but notice Parker's commanding presence as he made his way toward Vin, his expression cold and stern. "Hey you, Parker," barked his voice cutting through the park tranquility. "What are you doing here? This park isn't a place to lay around all day." Vin slowly lifted his head. His calm eyes hidden behind the sunglasses, he removed them, his gaze meeting Parker with an unwavering calmness. "I'm just enjoying the park," Vin replied, his deep voice steady. "Is there a problem?" Parker sneered, his lip curling into a contemptuous smirk. "People like you don't belong here," he said with a sneering tone. "Get up and leave before I make things worse for you." Vin maintained his composure and responded, "I don't believe I've done anything wrong. I have the same right to sit here as anyone else." Vin's composed tone only fueled Parker's growing anger. The officer stepped closer, his broad shoulders pushed forward, as if to intimidate Vin with his physical presence. "Who do you think you are to talk back to me?" Parker growled, his hand tightening around the baton, his eyes flashing with irritation. Parker stood there for a moment, seemingly waiting for Vin to bow to his authority and comply, but Vin didn't move. His gaze stayed fixed on Parker's face, his silence speaking volumes to Parker. It was as if Vin was daring him to act, unable to control his temper. Parker drew his baton from his belt, raised it high, and struck Vin hard on the back. The heavy thud of the impact startled nearby onlookers. A few people stopped in their tracks, their faces etched with shock. Vin leaned forward slightly from the unexpected blow, but quickly regained his posture. Vin's full frame slowly rose from the bench, his towering figure now casting a shadow over Parker as Vin turned to face the officer. His eyes burned with a steely resolve. The calmness that had been in his gaze moments earlier was replaced. With an intense and unwavering determination, Parker stood his ground, refusing to back down. He smirked, attempting to maintain his arrogance. "What are you going to do now, hit me back?" he said mockingly. Onlookers began to gather, some pulling out their phones to record the escalating situation. The tension between Vin and Parker seemed to make the air around them heavier. Vin remained silent, but his expression spoke volumes. He wasn't afraid, nor did he falter. His composed demeanor left Parker even more uncertain. What had started as a minor confrontation now drew the attention of the entire corner of the park. Parker looked at Vin Diesel with unmistakable anger in his eyes. Vin's calm demeanor felt like a direct challenge, especially as people around them began to notice the situation. Taking another step forward, Parker's voice grew sharper as he repeated his demand for Vin to leave the park. "You've got no business here. Don't make things harder for yourself." Vin stood firm, his posture straight and unwavering. "I have as much right to be here as anyone else," he replied, his voice steady and resolute. His words carried no hostility, only a simple and undeniable assertion. The gathering crowd started to grow larger, with some quietly pulling out their phones to record what was happening. Parker noticed this but had no intention of backing down. Instead, he felt the need to assert his authority even more. Gripping his baton tightly, he suddenly pulled it from his belt and swung it toward Vin. Vin reacted quickly, stepping back to dodge the strike. His movement was precise and controlled, showing no aggression. Parker, thrown off balance by the force of his own swing, paused briefly to steady himself. He didn't give up, however, and moved closer, raising the baton again as if preparing for another attack before Parker could strike again. Vin raised his hand, grabbing the baton firmly and pulling it away. The baton slipped from Parker's grip in an instant, and Vin tossed it aside. The crowd began murmuring with some gasping in shock. While others looked at Parker with visible disapproval, Parker stepped back now, unarmed, his face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment. Vin said nothing more, standing still and meeting Parker's gaze, directly making the officer visibly uneasy. The situation continued to draw more attention, and whispers rippled through the growing crowd as Parker struggled to regain his composure. Two other police officers arrived on the scene. They approached quickly, their eyes scanning the scene before them. One officer, Blake, moved closer to Parker, while the other officer, Martinez, turned to the crowd to gather information. Blake noticed the baton lying on the ground, and then looked at Parker. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone calm but authoritative. Parker, still trying to maintain some semblance of control, pointed at Vin. "He attacked me. I told him to leave, but he refused and took my weapon." Blake turned to Vin Diesel, his expression neutral but inquisitive. "Would you like to explain what happened here?" he asked, his voice neither accusatory nor dismissive, only seeking CL. Vin took a step forward, standing tall as he spoke. "I was just sitting here enjoying the park. I wasn't doing anything wrong, but he came over and started harassing me without reason, and then he attacked me." Blake nodded as he listened. Martinez, after speaking with several members of the crowd, returned to Blake. "I've reviewed a video from one of the bystanders." Martinez reported Parker initiated the attack. Vin was just defending himself. Blake frowned, his expression growing more serious as he turned back to Parker. "If this is true, then you've clearly crossed the line," Blake said firmly. Parker stammered, trying to come up with an excuse. "I thought he looked suspicious. I was just doing my job," he mumbled. But his words carried little weight in the face of the clear evidence presented by the video Martinez had reviewed. Blake gestured toward Parker. "Hand over your badge and weapon. We'll be reporting this incident to higher authorities for further investigation." Reluctantly, Parker complied. His head bowed as he removed his badge and surrendered his weapon. Vin Diesel, watching the scene unfold, stepped forward and addressed Blake. "I don't want to cause trouble, but I can't let this go unchecked. He needs to be held accountable for his actions." Blake nodded in agreement. "We'll handle this fairly. Thank you for your cooperation." As Martinez escorted Parker away, the crowd began to disperse. A few people approached Vin to thank him for standing up against the abuse of power. A woman holding her phone still recording spoke to him. "You did the right thing. This will remind everyone that no one, not even the police, is above the rules." Vin smiled faintly and nodded at her. "Sometimes we need to stand up not just for ourselves but for others," he said, his tone calm yet deeply meaningful. Vin Diesel walked slowly along the brick pathways of the park, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the setting sun cast its golden glow. Those around him, while enjoying the peaceful afternoon, couldn't stop discussing the incident that had just unfolded. A few people approached, offering their support with simple words of thanks, nods of acknowledgement, or looks of sympathy. A middle-aged man wearing a fat, aided shirt and an old baseball cap stepped closer to Vin. His voice was horror but warm. "You did something many of us wouldn't dare to do," he said, gripping his cane tightly. "We need people like you to remind us that injustice cannot be ignored." Vin looked at him with gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you. I just did what needed to be done. Sometimes doing nothing is the wrong choice." The man nodded, his hand trembling as he patted Vin gently on the shoulder, before walking away. The young boy Vin had met earlier reappeared, clutching a small notebook and a pen in his hands. His eyes shone with admiration. "Can you sign this for me?" the boy asked, his voice quivering with excitement. Vin smiled and knelt down to meet the boy at eye level, taking the notebook and pen. He wrote a short but meaningful message. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the act of moving forward. Despite it, the boy read the words, then looked up at Vin and nodded, as if he understood. The boy's mother, standing a few steps away, approached Vin with a grateful smile. Her eyes radiated appreciation. "Thank you for what you did," she said. "You didn't just stand up for yourself. You've set an example for others." Vin stood and nodded to her. "I hope we can create a community where no one has to face things like this." As Vin left, his eyes passed over the area where the confrontation had taken place. The baton still lay discarded on the ground, a small but powerful symbol of a conflict that he knew would leave a lasting impression on those who witnessed it. He could feel the gaze of the remaining onlookers following him, not with curiosity or surprise, but with respect and support. Outside the park, the streetlights began to flicker on their glow, reflecting on the cobblestone paths of New York City. The bustling sounds of traffic and chatter formed the familiar symphony of a city that never sleeps. Vin moved through the space at an unhurried pace, letting the events of the day replay in his mind. The memories of the encounter remained vivid. He couldn't help but think of those who had endured similar situations, but lacked the opportunity to stand up for themselves. He realized that what had happened today, though just a small piece of a much larger picture, could serve as inspiration for greater changes in the future. At a street corner, as Vin waited for the light to change, a young woman approached him. She explained that she had recorded the entire incident and wanted to share the video on social media. "I think people need to know what happened today," she said, her voice filled with determination. Vin looked at her for a moment before nodding. "If it can help people see that they're not alone, then do it," he said. The woman smiled in gratitude and walked away, leaving Vin staring ahead. The light turned green, and he continued on his way, blending into the flow of people hurrying home after a long day. Yet his steps remained calm and measured, a stark contrast to the city's frantic energy in his mind. The words of the middle-aged man, the young boy, and the boy's mother echoed. He understood that he hadn't stood up just for himself, but for everyone who couldn't. What had happened today wasn't an ending, but the beginning of a much longer journey. As night fell, the neon lights of the city illuminated the towering buildings. Vin glanced upward at the sky, where stars faintly sparkled between the skyscrapers. A sense of relief washed over him, accompanied by a renewed resolve, turning onto a quiet street. Vin stopped in front of a familiar coffee shop. He walked in, ordered a black coffee, and found a seat near the window, taking a sip of the warm drink. He gazed outside at the ceaseless movement of the city. He felt part of its rhythm, yet at the same time as though he stood outside it, observing and reflecting thoughts of justice, injustice, and personal responsibility filled his mind. Vin knew that today's story wouldn't simply end here. It would live on in retellings, in videos, and in conversations among those who had witnessed it. And he hoped that somewhere it would inspire someone else to stand up for what's right, just as he had when Vin Diesel stepped out of the coffee shop. The neon glow of the city painted his silhouette against the restless night. His steps were slow, but his impact thundered through the streets. He didn't need applause. He didn't need recognition. He had already won. The echoes of what had just happened would ripple far beyond this park, beyond this night. Somewhere a stranger would watch that footage and realize they too could stand up. Somewhere a man in uniform would hesitate before abusing his power. Somewhere justice had taken one small step forward. Vin glanced up at the sky, where the city lights drowned out the stars. Yet one or two still managed to shine through. Like hope, like resistance, like the undeniable truth that some fights must be fought, no matter the cost. And as he disappeared into the sea of people, his presence lingered, not just in the park, not just in the streets, but in the hearts of those who had witnessed what happens when one person refuses to back down. Because tonight, the world had seen it. And tonight, justice didn't just speak. It roared.